Together, see we do it right. Together, can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must do his bit.
Welcome to another edition of The Public Interest. My name is David Granger, and in this series of programs, we investigate matters of public interest to all Guyanese at home and abroad. And unfortunately, I have to return to a subject that I've dealt with on previous programs. That is the topic of violence. We've dealt with criminal violence. We've dealt with domestic violence. We've dealt with gang violence. We've dealt with sexual violence. We've dealt with frontier violence. And today, we're dealing with cultural violence. It is quite unfortunate that we have to spend so much time on violence, but violence is real. And unless we resolve the conflicts inside our country that lead to violence, particularly cultural conflicts, things are going to get worse. And we can start by looking at what happened at Woodley Park on the West Coast of Belize, what we now know as Region 5. And Woodley Park is the most recent arena of cultural violence. The abuse and assault of school children on the 17th of February, 2023 was frightening. It's frightening because we've seen this before. It's all deja vu. You know, this is similar to what happened in the same Region 5 at Bath Settlement and Bushlot on the 6th of March, 2020. On that day, on the 6th of March, we had about a dozen simultaneous riots. You can almost say they were coordinated. Surprisingly, they all started about the same time and they all ended about the same time. They were right at Blackbush Pole, East Kanji, and number 19 village, Tain village in Region 6, East Belize Quarantine. There were riots at Luzignan in Region 4. There are riots at Canal Number 1, Canal Number 2, Cornelia Ida in Region 3. And there are several other places, but these riots just emerged like clockwork. And they were, in some cases, violent. Police had to be called out. And as you know, someone was shot and killed. But these riots are expressions of a serious cultural malaise. And once you start to attack school children, they will remember those injuries for the rest of their lives. And this is exactly what happened at Woodley Park. This is what happened when the school buses were stoned on the 6th of March, 2020. People never forget that day. Then, of course, you know what happened at Cotton Tree, the grisly slaughter. I just can't call it murder, it's slaughter of those two Henry boys. And of course, another boy was killed. And that plunged West Belize into violence more deeply. And then we had other instances of violence. And I say violence, not because there was no bloodshed, but they were violent. The forceful removal of residents. You remember the situation at Success Village on the East Coast Demerara? You remember the scenes at Mocha Arcadia? I don't want to comment further on that matter because some of the residents have gone to the law courts. And then we know what happened in Region 2 after the murder or in Boston, Dartmouth Village. We know what happened after the murder of Quindon Bacchus, the Monrepo riots in June 2022. And then we see, when you add, Woodley Park to all of these incidents, you see that there is a process of rot, of social decay, of disintegration. And these are the ways that cultural violence are being expressed in Guyana today. And where does it all come from? It doesn't drop from the sky. We remember back in November 2017, when I was president, the leader of the opposition at that time, he displayed a placard stating that social cohesion is a farce. And of course, later on, as if in a sort of copycat performance, the present opposition, created a furor in the National Assembly. But in a way, they were just copying what was done before by the previous opposition when the president of the country tried to address the parliament. And then, of course, you remember also in September 2019, when a group of protesters surrounded, the entrance to the Pegasus Hotel, where I was to deliver an address to the Guyana Manufacturing Services Association. And even while I was addressing the members of that association, a group of people, including a serving minister now, just pulled the placards from under their clothing and tried to create a ruckus. And the association was so embarrassed, they sent me a letter of apology. But that is the sort of cultural behavior which I described as Bulgarian, which was typified then and which is on display today. And this is where the Guyanese children, young people, are getting their role models, and they're not very good models. We must ask ourselves as Guyanese citizens, what causes this violence? What causes the sort of cultural violence that's taking place? And it's manifesting itself in places like Woodley Park or Monrepo or Dartmouth, Coventry. We are products of the British Empire, this thing called Guyana. Colonialism is not a pleasant experience. It is cultural violence, that is all. Colonialism is violence. It is created by violence. It is enforced by violence. It entrenches economic exploitation and political exclusion. When we got independence, we had to decolonize. We could not continue in the same way. I mean, some of the younger persons among you will find it hard to believe there were clubs in Georgetown which Indians and Africans and American people couldn't go to. There were places in this country which were closed. There was, for want of a better word, there was a sort of apartheid in Guyana during colonial period. So we had to decolonize. And in decolonizing, we adopted some conventions. We actually invented new symbols. The flag is an invention. The national honors are inventions. The national motto is an invention. We had to develop new social relations. And no matter how bitter you think the experience has been, some countries have had it worse. But most post-colonial countries, even some of the older states, have had to deal with this question of national unity. It is not a slogan. It's not something that you simply achieve by talking about it. One Guyana, national unity, and so on. Even some of the older countries had bloody civil wars in order to forge or hammer out what they now call unity. The United States of America had a bloody civil war between, the so-called Confederates and, and the Federal in the North. Britain had civil war. France had civil wars. Russia had civil wars. China had civil wars. Italy had civil wars. So we mustn't believe that these countries simply achieved their unity by peaceful negotiation. I'm not advocating violence, but I'm saying that national unity was very difficult to achieve, even after some of the so-called new states became independent. There were bloody civil wars in Africa and Asia. You can think of the bloody partition of India between what is now India and Pakistan. And then, of course, there's another partition creating Bangladesh. Think of Nigeria, and I always recall the statements of a very famous Nigerian politician who said Nigeria is not a nation, it's a geographical expression. And it was it was a torturous course to hammer out unity. And then there've been civil wars in Uganda, in Sudan, in Sri Lanka, even in Cyprus. So the question of national unity is one that residents and citizens have to answer by coming together in a cooperative and consensual manner. So in Guyana, just throwing wrong slogans is not going to work. We need to adopt a different attitude if we are to overcome this problem of cultural violence. When we speak of cultural violence, what do we mean anyway? We mean the attitudes, the beliefs, the actions, the language that we use in order to justify violence. And in Guyana, violence is pervasive in terms of language, in terms of the attitudes, in terms of beliefs. And we see a form of violence which is in part the result of ignorance. It is the result of the inequalities in society. It is the result of ill will. And very frequently, as happened in Woodley Park, it's the result of intentional incitement. Violence breeds violence. And most dangerously, calculated, cold-blooded violence against children can endure for their entire lives. Cultural violence is the opposite of cultural cohesion. That's what it is. People who oppose cohesion, in a way, are supportive of the opposite. Violence, as I said, is aggravated by attitudes and policies which impair social solidarity. They impoverish parts of the population and they isolate people, isolate villages, isolate communities, rather than integrate them. In Guyanese history, the most violent episodes were the disturbances of 1964. And I suppose next year people will be observing the anniversary of that horrible episode. And then, of course, in the early part of this century, we had the Troubles. And there again, you see how the disturbances and the Troubles thrived when ignorance and equality and incitement prevailed. And there has been a lot of incitement. There has been a lot of ignorance. We know what the Constitution says about inclusionary democracy, Article 13. One NGO has named itself Article 13. We know about the institutions, we know about legislation, the Ethnic Relations Commission, the Prevention of Discrimination Act. These institutions and this legislation all seek to remove the impediments to social cohesion. And in my own administration, we sought to break down the barriers among ethnic groups so that we can understand one another better. I introduced the observance of Chinese Arrival Day. Well, it was always there, but it was never observed as a national day on the 12th of January. I introduced the observance of Portuguese Arrival Day on the 3rd of May. And I know we celebrate the 5th of May, which is actually Indian Arrival Day. So these days were observed because they should be used for reflection on and respect of other peoples, in our country, and they should be maintained. They should be observed. But unfortunately, now they're ignored, and it's hard to tell when one of these events occur. Then we had a commemoration of our workers, particularly the Rose Hall martyrs, on the 13th of March. That, as you may or may not know, was actually gazetted as a national observance. Demerara Martyrs on the 20th of August, Enmo Martyrs, 16th of June. We've celebrated that for a long period of time, but it is actually gazetted as a day of observance. And these days are important because they remind the present generation of the struggles and sacrifices of their forefathers. That is how we got here in 2023. Because of the Demerara martyrs, because of the Rose Hall martyrs, because of the Enmo martyrs. We must recognize that these days should be observed and not disparaged or dismissed. Just as we have Chinese and Portuguese and Indian arrival day, we must understand our people who came here and the contribution that they made to making Guyana what it is today. And in my view, this cultural understanding will help to prevent the cultural violence which is taking place in the country. It seems a bit of an innocent analysis to feel that violence is a result of ignorance alone, because some of it is quite deliberate. And we need to understand everybody in society, not just one group or another group, but every group in society, if we are to avoid the type of violence we saw at Woodley Park on the 17th of February. In my view, my friends, the decisions to dismantle the Department of Social Cohesion and to discard the Social Cohesion Action Plan were big mistakes on the part of this administration. There is a Social Cohesion Action Plan, and there is, or there used to be, a Department of Social Cohesion headed by a minister. And once you remove the bases for social cohesion, well, social cohesion will collapse. And you can't try to establish a One Guyana Commission or a card of unity when there is no infrastructural basis, there's no bureaucracy, there's no ministry, there's no officialdom, there's nothing pushing it. It's just a slogan. Slogans alone can't work. And we need to decide how we're going to promote national unity without a civil war, of course. How will we promote national unity without the foundations, the institutional framework to make these policies work? And APNU AFC coalition, yes, we're out of office, but we introduced measures to promote social integration. We introduced measures to create a community of belonging, of commonality, if you want to call it, so that every group could practice its particular culture. And in that regard, I believe that we made a tremendous success of social cohesion. Of course, it's really a work in progress, and much more work has to be done. And that is why we're so disappointed that the department has been shut down and the plan has been scrapped. My friends, we need to move forward. We've had enough Moripo, we've had enough cotton trees, we have enough bad settlements and bush lots, we've had enough Dartmouths, we've had enough Woodley Parks, and Thames and East Kanji. We don't want to go back there. We don't need the disturbances again. We don't need, the troubles again. And unfortunately, the signs are not promising. A lot more work has to be done. Society is becoming unbalanced, and once society is unbalanced, there is going to be disaffection and dissatisfaction. Social inequalities cannot be corrected by catchphrases. You can't just throw out a few slogans and expect that, the slogans alone will do the work of structures. Slogans are no substitute, they're no solutions to social conflict. When we have a society which is balanced, which is socially balanced, there's going to be greater security, greater stability, and greater solidarity. I believe that these values are missing to a greater or lesser degree. That is one of the reasons why we have so many young university graduates leaving the country, so many professionals leaving the country. Nurses, doctors, teachers are heading out of the country because they feel that the country of their birth is becoming unbalanced or has become unbalanced. And it means that we must adopt policies which emphasize our identity as a nation. We are a unique nation. And yes, Chinese arrival, Portuguese arrival, Indian arrival, Armenian heritage, but all of these, African emancipation, all of these are part of our national identity. And we must emphasize that there is unity in diversity. We must also embrace inclusivity at the political and social levels. Now, this is important that many of the older Guyanese before 1966 lived in a divided society, and many people have contributed to sometimes inventing, at other times adopting symbols and ceremonies which emphasize national unity. At the same time, we have to work at the political level to eradicate inequalities. In its worst form, there are still huge gaps between the rich and poor. And these gaps were widened during the pandemic. And you saw that some of the poor people were becoming poorer. And paradoxically, rich people are becoming richer. There are gaps between coastland and hinterland. And it is clear that many people in what is the hinterland do not have the access or opportunity to some of the benefits of the utilities and public services on the coast. And that is one of the reasons, and I emphasize that is one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason why we created those 4 towns at Martika, Mabruma, Madia, and Lethem, so that the government could provide services, education, health, public utilities, to the people in those regions, which constitute more than 75% of our territory. And it means that over a period of time, the inequalities between West Essequibo and those persons living east of the Essequibo will be removed. And, a child at Lethem or Maria who does well at National Grade 6 could stay in his own town or his own region and receive quality education. Doesn't have to come and live in a hostel in the coastline, you see. We have to remove those barriers between rural areas and urban areas. All of this is part of building a cohesive society. So it is not just one thing, it's just not talking about it. We need to remove the factors which foster alienation and which foster social degradation. My friends, cultural violence festers among people and in situations where there are allegations, there are actions, there are threats which alienate communities, which erode cooperation, and which create inequalities among people and among communities. Those people in our country who sow the seeds of discord, who seek to divide workers, people who deride civil society, people who disparage communities will reap a very bitter harvest. And in my lifetime, in the 60s, we saw what the crop would be, what the harvest would be, because at that time, over 176 people were reported by the police to be murdered. Many more were murdered. But in the short period of 6 months, 176 people were murdered, above the average. And unfortunately, in the 2000s, during the so-called troubles, more people were murdered. And the bodies have never been counted, but they're over 400 persons murdered at that time. But you can go to Bartik and see the monuments. You can go to Ivleri and see the monuments. You can go to Buxton and see the monuments. You can go to Lusignan and see the monuments. It never happened before, and we must make sure it doesn't happen again. My friends, today I speak about cultural violence. And unless we overcome cultural violence with social cohesion, the type of episodes that we saw at Woodley Park could recur. There's no need for people in our country to have to take to the street in order to get justice, in order to call for justice. And there's no need for people to go into schools and harm school children, stone school buses. What is the political message? How could that bring about, a corridor of unity? How could that bring about one Guyana? How could it bring about social cohesion? It is contrary to everything that traditional Guyanese values hold dear. So we speak of cultural violence. We speak of measures to avoid that cultural violence. Let us leave the disturbances behind. Let us leave the troubles behind. Let us sincerely adopt measures which are socially cohesive and which could prevent the recurrence of those dreadful events. And I think the older ones or the sober ones among us would see what happened in Woodley Park on the 17th of February is really a ghastly reminder of what happened during the troubles and the disturbances. Let us hope and pray that Guyana could become more socially cohesive and that our children could look forward to living in a peaceful country without threat, without fear of violence. Thank you, and may God bless you all.
Let us cooperate for the younger. Let us cooperate for our land. Let us resolve to fight together. See we do it right together. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Each man must